Before I introduce the speaker, I want to say a few words of thanks to our sponsors. This exhibition, which gathers together sort of 50 rarely seen masterpieces, is the kind of show that I think we come to expect from the Metropolitan Museum, but it is not the kind of show that corporations rush to sponsor. So it is with a great deal of gratitude that I want to thank Mrs. Alexandra P. Rosenberg and Michel David-Vey, both of whom are great friends of the museum and friends in particular of the medieval department, for lending financial support for the show. And the Andrew Mellon Foundation helped to pay for the catalog, which I think continues the standards of sumptuousness that you expect from the Met. And I also want to thank you, the taxpayers, because it is federal monies through a program administered by the Federal Council of the Arts and Humanities that helps to underwrite this exhibition. Without it, we really couldn't afford to put it on, and it also kind of the lenders themselves receive a sort of deeper assurance that we will take good care of their works. So it's a vital part of a vital source of funding for this exhibition. Edward Tufte. I suspect that many of us here, and I would include myself among them, are sort of members of the cult of Edward Tufte. Some of you know him. In fact, I know because someone came up to me just the other day to tell me they know him from his teaching. He was a professor for 32 years at Princeton and then at Yale, a professor of computer science, political science, statistics, and computer science, a great combination. And then he has gone on to do seminars, which I suspect many of you have attended, and there's more coming up in New York, I believe, a little later this month. Some of you may know him from his more recent endeavors as a sculptor, and in fact, as we speak, there is an exhibition of his sculpture on view at the Aldridge Contemporary Art Museum in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and that will be there until January. But I think most of us know him and treasure him for the work he has done on 4 classic books. The visual display of quantitative information, envisioning information, visual explanations, and beautiful evidence. These are sort of classic works on analytical design and visual thinking. They are extraordinary for their beauty. I think they're gorgeous books. Their insightfulness, and the originality of their approach. I think he's really taught us whole new ways of thinking about things we might not have been thinking so much about. And the relationship between aesthetics and effective communication. So in my list of, that little brief list of what Mr. Tufte has achieved, I have yet to mention that he knows very much at all about medieval art, which is the occasion, of course, for bringing him here. And someone said to me, Melanie, you have 2 slots at Sunday at the Met. Why Mr. Tufte? But that really comes from sort of a long-standing admiration for his work, though I don't think his books ever appeared on a single syllabus of a class that I took through my many years of study. I have nonetheless felt that we art historians, and particularly those of us who are students of medieval art, have a lot to learn from Professor Tufte. You know, medieval art, I like to think of medieval artists as the first great producers of information graphics. And if you don't believe me, you need to get up and see the exhibition upstairs. They were really, those artists were really the first to understand the way in which word and image could work together, needed to work together to convey information. They were the first to really understand, I think, the way that, that graphics are, beautiful graphics are just as important as the text in conveying vital information. So I don't know what he's going to do, but I can't wait to see. And with that, Professor Edward Tufte.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Here's a woodcut drawing of the royal dining table, a three-dimensional object caught up in the flatland of two-dimensional presentation. But alas, as you can see, the table fails to hold the pots and plates. As their meal slips and slides off, the king and queen watch in exasperation and exclaim, "It's the way they draw these wretched tables." Shall we call this drawing, "This is not a table"? And when you think about it, "This is not a table" is somewhat deeper than Magritte's "This is not a pipe," "Souchet n'est pas une pipe," since, among other things, the woodcut table was not even a working table in the woodcut of the table itself. In the drawing of the woodcut table, the joke is how the methodology of presentation has gotten mixed up with the content. Likewise, in this stable at Bethlehem, complete with ox and donkey, notice that the stable has a tiled floor. This is a really nice stable, the Plaza Hotel of stables, and that it's unintentionally humorous as the technology has in fact become content. The angels levitate, but also note Mary's levitating booties. As the artist, probably Rudolf Stahler in 1522, can't quite get the booties to stay down on the floor. We'll work on that in next week's 3D drawing class. Or here is a supercomputer animation frame of a thunderstorm. And the dominant visual effect, some 65% of the pixels, is the orthodontic grid. There are some early Renaissance paintings of St. John lost out in the wilderness, and where he manages to find a small tiled area to stand upon to preserve perspective or try to show perspective. The method of production has interfered with the content. Our knowledge today is sometimes imprisoned by the arbitrary technology of image making, just as in this map of Matthew Paris, some 750 years ago, was constrained to produce this conspicuously squarish map of Britain. You'll notice that Britain there is quite squarish. A note on this map, drawn around 1250, explains the distortion. Quote, "The whole island should have been longer if only the page had permitted." Sounds a lot like a PowerPoint manual, huh? Magritte's pipe painting was in fact titled "The Treachery of Images." That a painting of a pipe is not a pipe is something we knew before we started. But it's good to be reminded that today we do most of our serious visual and analytical thinking while sitting indoors, staring at representations of real things on the unreal flatlands of paper and computer screen. We're all pretty good at intense visual analysis and thinking when it's in flatland on paper or the computer screen. And for the real world of real things, in contrast, most of our thinking is about wayfinding rather than the deep analysis that we routinely do when looking at paper or computer screens. How can we have the intensity of reading a poem or doing math or studying a painting out there in real space, out there in Spaceland? And for about the past 10 years, I've been seriously trying to understand this, and my current work is in three dimensions. I make very large three-dimensional abstract sculptures, and my essay, Seeing Around, reasons about our seeing in three space, and you have that essay in your handouts. And that show is at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum until at least January 2010. In the fine exhibit here, Pen and Parchment, Drawing the Middle Ages, The consistently remarkable feature of the drawings is their integration of text and image. Evidence that bears on questions of any complexity typically involves multiple forms of discourse. In modern scientific research, for example, 25% of all published materials are graphs, tables, diagrams, images. The other 75% are words. Or consider a more selective sample from 1610. Galileo's starry messenger, Sidereus Nuncius, is 30% images and diagrams, all integrated within the text. Or for a more visual subject, the aesthetic theory and practical geometry of art, architecture, letter forms, Albrecht Dührer's A Course in the Art of Measurement, 1525, consists of 52% drawings, 48% text, with the woodcuts and words combined throughout the book. Evidence is evidence, whether words, numbers, images, diagrams, still or moving. It is all information after all. For readers and viewers, the intellectual tasks remain constant regardless of the particular mode of evidence. To understand and to reason about the materials at hand and to appraise their quality, relevance, and integrity. In manuscripts, as the word suggests, manus plus hand plus scriptus, which is pretty much like writing, the common source of all marks is the handheld pen, pencil, brush. Thus, the hand itself directly integrates word and image, as in Galileo's drawings of anatomy, nature, and engineering, Galileo's manuscripts on astronomy and physics, ordinary notebooks, and today's comics. And especially in this wonderful centaur from a remarkable 9th century manuscript. A triumph of multifunctioning signs and of the unification of text and image, this splendid zodiacal word centaur is from a Carolingian manuscript, 9th century, portraying many constellations as word pictures, word stories. Written in rustic script, the Latin words, as the amazing art historian Meyer Shapiro wrote, the words form wavy tracks, and through that curvature, they model the form, giving it the fullness and convexity of the flank and rear of a horse. Close quote. Words begin and end so as to outline the legs and body, and the resulting perimeter links 44 star dots that more or less form the southern constellation of Centaurus. A variety of centaurs, some facing left, others right, all except for this, nearly wordless, have wandered through 2,000 years of celestial charts. Same stars, many centaurs. By outlining two-space projections of the stars, however, constellation maps create an illusory flatland out of what are, in fact, non-adjacent stars residing in three-space at different distances. Notice now that astronomers can accurately measure the distances of many stars from Earth, perhaps it's time to draw three-space celestial maps with a new visual verbal geometries and narratives that will show where the stars reside in the depths of space as well. The space beyond us is a space, not a surface. And of course, this centaur is constructed only from stars visible to the unassisted eye. Galileo's telescope changed all that. Galileo's report of his discovery of the rings of Saturn deploys a design similar to that of the centaur. A few astronomical observations surrounded by words. What we're looking at is probably the best piece of analytical design ever done. The content is, of course, incredible. This is the first human eye to see the rings of Saturn, and you see the two little drawings embedded in the text. That's what Galileo saw in his telescope, and he says, Saturn looks like this, and there it is, sitting there, perfect text-figure integration, and 2 lines later, he says, when it's a little blurry, it looks like that. And this and that may be about the best piece of analytical design ever done. First, the findings are very cool. There's a comparison between what Saturn looks like under favorable and unfavorable viewing conditions. And there's also something going on here that Galileo, in his first book, The Starry Messenger, made clear that was going on. Is what we're really seeing with Galileo is we have now the intellectual and visual authority of the image. Before Galileo, the way people did astronomy was guys sitting around in armchairs speculating, and the winning theory was the theory endorsed by the church or by royalty, or the theory that was most compatible with the fantasies of Aristotle. All that ended with Galileo. He talks about what he calls visible certainty replacing wordy authority. And in that diagram, the words, the images are replacing words. The image, the evidence of the eye. Although the original Latin centaur is incomprehensible to most modern eyes, because it's in Latin, incomprehensible to most eyes for all time, nearly everywhere, today we easily grasp the visual meaning of this centaur, drawn 1,200 years ago. There are stars, real and imaginary objects, contoured shape reading as 3 space, an outline constellation map in 2 space, a narrative metaphor grouping the stars into a constellation. And this is true for most images. There is a similar continuity of showing and seeing. Cryon, the centaur, exemplifies the universality of images and the stupefying locality of languages. Images are cosmopolitan and forever. Words are local and parochial. Now, just look at this. Here the centaur is translated and reconstructed into English. First Latin, now English, only a few thousand more languages to go. My design assistant and I spent 2 or 3 months in Photoshop to do that. Written here in English using the letter forms of the original rustic script, the poem recalls the harrowing career, noble exploits, and excellent character of this centaur. There are 2 kinds of centaurs, by the way, good ones and bad ones. Cryon is a good one, and we have here this fine cartoon animal, half human, half horse. And all those words up there, well, a few of them even describe the stars. So we have another kind of segregation of text and image. When the words are in a language unknown to the viewer, then images and words become segregated into the comprehensible, the image, and the incomprehensible, the words. Consider one of the most beautiful books ever made. Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, published by Aldus Manutius in 1499. This is a wonderful book, both the images and the words, of which we now have become fully aware because of an excellent translation done by Jocelyn Goodwin, published, 500 years later in 1999. The book is written in a marvelous, jaunty tone, And as an author of books, my favorite part in Hypnerotomachia is in the opening elegy, where it says, "Receive what this great cornucopia has offered. Behold, a useful and profitable book. If you think otherwise, do not lay the blame on the book, but on yourself." Dear reader, Hypnerotomachia has been studied for centuries by design students as an aesthetic exemplar of printing, layout, artwork, and typography, that is, of design, and only that, since very few could read the original words, a unique confected Italian, Latin, Greek hybrid language. The verbal content is incomprehensible. Unreadable classics do at least teach that some books are beautiful simply as pure, amazing art objects. Alas, they also teach content indifference. In text-image relations, designers need only to consider aesthetics effects. Those books might well teach. Of course, such effects are central to decorative and commercial art. But for serious analytic work in reasoning about evidence, the essential test of text-image relations is how well they assist the understanding of the content, how well they tell the story, the content story, not how perfectly stylish the pages or the art looks. To make this test, one must know what the words mean. Oddly enough, must know what the words mean in the relation to the images and what the images mean in relation to the words. And sometimes, as Eric Gill said, if you look after truth and goodness, beauty takes care of herself. So I have a suggestion to museums on how to show drawings with Latin text. Make an English or French or Italian or whatever translation you need, and then show it side by side with the original. That is, do the centaur translation dance. For a long time, the amazing reality of stars was caught up in a thick mythology, astrology of constellation maps, elaborate stories, ambiguous images imposed upon the starry sky. Along with providing cues for recalling classical mythology, star myths may help organize and remember the spatial locations of some stars. And sometimes myth helps to fill in the space where evidence and data are lacking. But they are nonetheless myths. Jonathan Swift indicted map makers who substituted embellishment for data. He said, "With savage pictures fill their gaps, and o'er unhabitable towns place elephants for want of towns." And in China, they got maps right about 1050. Almost 1,000 years ago. And without designer elephants, 450 years way ahead of anyone else. Many of the drawings from the Middle Ages shown here seek to depict information rather than in the Metropolitan, seek to depict information rather than rehashing myth. This is a great big idea in human history and in the human cognitive style, to show empirical observations of the real world. These empirical observations, the evidence of the eye being shown, test explanatory theories and separate fiction from nonfiction. For any display that is nonfiction, such as a map, a genealogical diagram, a star constellation chart, there is the eternal issue of the reality, the truth of the content, the empirical truth of the content. Illustrations describing reality should be Well, reality-based, evidence-based, not story-based or faith-based. Images, nonfiction images, should be accurate and true. Going beyond images that are simply descriptive, what are the deeper things to look at in displays of information, in nonfiction illustrations? What are the fundamental intellectual tasks provoked by nonfiction works? And the answer to that question is found in part as we go through your handout. If you'll get your poster out here and the lights will come up, you can see your copy. We shall all have Napoleon's March here out in front of us. Everybody should have the poster within the eye span, now, okay? Or if you didn't get one, look at a colleague. Up at the top is the French version. Down at the bottom is the English translation of the original. And what we're going to see in action on this incredible, wonderful display are the fundamental intellectual tasks that human beings conduct in reasoning about nonfiction evidence. And consequently, these are the fundamental intellectual tasks of the presenter of the material as well. This is the story of the French invasion of Russia in 1812. Moscow is in the upper right-hand corner. Over on the left is the Polish-Russian border. And this is War and Peace as told by a visual Tolstoy. The invasion begins over on the left at the Niemen River. And you see the tan flow line as it moves to the east toward Moscow. And that flow line shows the march of Napoleon, the French army, toward Moscow to our right. And the width shows the dreadful consequences as the width of that line measures the number of surviving soldiers. As the soldiers die, the line narrows. They begin with 422,000 troops over on the left. The line narrows. They reach Moscow now with 100,000 survivors. The dark line moving to the west, to our left, is the path of retreat. The disaster continues. Notice the line of retreat is briefly thickened as some flanking troops rejoin the retreating army. But then notice where the line of retreat intersects with the Berezina River, and you see a discontinuity. And that is where nearly half the soldiers remaining in this now ragtag army of Napoleon fell through the ice of the Berezina and drowned. And it is also where Napoleon, as many dear leaders do, distinguished himself by having his carriage, which was fleeing the Russian army, driven over the women and children on the bridge of the Berezina, so at least the dear leader could get out of town. The army winds up where it started, back at the Niemen River with 10,000 survivors. It is there, at the beginning and the end of the campaign, we have a small but poignant example of the first grand principle of analytical design, which is show comparisons. The fundamental thinking act, when we look at data, and also a lot of other kinds of evidence, is to answer the question, compared with what? Certainly, anytime we look at data, that's the heart of it. Doesn't matter whether there's an immense amount of data or lots of mathematics or lots of technical things or setting up experimental designs or doing multiple regressions. Underneath it all, the fundamental question is compared with what? If that's the intellectual task, then that should now provide instructions to the making of displays. That is, our displays should help show comparisons. That's grand principle 1. Show comparisons. So we see the tan line, the width when they started, 422,000 troops. Afterwards, the width of the black line, 10,000 survivors, 1 soldier, and 42 survived. This also illustrates the second grand principle in analytical thinking, and therefore in analytical design, which is show causality. Show causality, mechanism, dynamic structure, explanation. The reason that we care about causality is that any kind of intervention thinking is of necessity causality thinking. Any kind of policy thinking is of necessity causality thinking. That is, to produce the desired effect, we need to know about and be able to govern the cause. So again, that's the cognitive task, and our display should help us out by showing causality. Well, where's the causality here? That map is merely descriptive. It simply shows the location of the bad news. Doesn't say how it came to pass. But down below, the French engineer Minar, who designed this display, tied the path of the retreating army to a temperature scale down below. That's because Napoleon was defeated not so much by the Russian army, but rather by General Winter. It was bitterly cold, and many of the soldiers froze and starved. How cold? Well, look over on the left, lower left, at the temperature scale. Minus 26 degrees on the 7th of December, minus 30 on the 6th of December, and so on. And so that's how the possible causal variable has been brought in accord with the second grand principle, has been brought into this display. Napoleon's March also exemplifies the third grand principle, which is show multivariate data. That is, show things that are more than 2 variables, that in some sense get out of flatland. It's not just 2 dimensions of material, it's more than 2. Minar got 6 dimensions of data down on this flat piece of paper, 6 different variables. The 6 variables are the size of the army's location on the map, that is latitude and longitude. So we have 3 variables now, size and the 2-dimensional location, latitude and longitude, the direction the army is going, the temperatures, and the dates. 6 dimensions, and this is unaccompanied by any mumbo-jumbo from the IT department or the business department about a multivariate spatial temporal executive-based protocol-focused decision group. None of that bullshit. 6 dimensions with a real clarity. It's about what happened to the soldiers. The world we live in is, of course, multivariate. We navigate every day through 3 dimensions in time. 4-dimensional world. We do it all the time. Our display should capture some of that. Our flatland displays. This is a pretty good example of doing that. 6 dimensions, 6 different variables down here. This also illustrates grand principle 4 in analytical thinking, fundamental principles in analytical thinking. This might be called the whatever it takes principle. One version of it is completely integrate word, number, image, picture, graph, map, chart, movie, video, etc. It's all information after all. You might think of this as mode neutrality. From the point of view of reasoning about the content, it's all information. That actually means quite a bit. It means that our standards for videos are just as high as our intellectual standards for graphics or tables or any other mode of evidence. We should be at least as rigorous. Look what Minar did here. We have a paragraph of words up at the top. We have a map in the middle. We have a statistical graphic dangling from the map, and the thing is annotated all over with words and numbers. The spirit is whatever it takes. That's a very important idea, that we don't restrict ourselves to one mode of information to explain something. The attitude should be whatever it takes to explain something. And that probably will involve more than one method of more than one metaphor, more than one mode of production in evidence. I'm afraid that some of my colleagues over the years at Princeton and Yale, the kinds of questions they were asked is, how can a particular data set, single data set, and a particular mode of analysis deal with something? The right question is, how can something be explained? In other words, you might think there's a kind of method-driven approach, perfectly appropriate topic, but there's also a content-driven approach. And the content-driven approach is when you begin with the content, not with a pre-specified mode of production, not with a pre-specified data set, and the content mode of thinking, that is, how do you explain something? And the answer to that question almost invariably is whatever it takes. And it will take a pluralism of methods, of data sets, of modes of production. This also illustrates Grand Principle 5, which is document everything and tell people about it. Documentation is part of the fundamental quality control mechanism for the credibility of evidence, and also the credibility of the presenter of evidence. Your credibility in a presentation depends on your prior reputation for integrity before the presentation. It depends on the quality of the evidence and reasoning in the presentation, and it depends on the credibility of your sources of information. Say where the stuff comes from. Tell people where they can see the material, the full data set. Give scales of measurement. Provide a link to where they can see the entire database of material. Now, as a consumer of presentations, you should be skeptical of those who fail to document their material. In fact, your default should probably be that they are cherry pickers. And they don't want to tell you where the stuff came from because they've made their argument by showing you the sweetest and ripest cherries that support their point of view. The single biggest threat, indeed, to learning the truth from a presentation outside of line and outside of total ignorance is cherry picking of information. And so we, as a consumer of presentation, want to see where the stuff came from, to leave open the possibility that the other people could see where the material came from. Now, everybody notice what just happened here. A principle for making a presentation, a nonfiction presentation, was turned into a principle for consuming a nonfiction presentation. That is, presenters are encouraged to document everything, and consumers of presentations have an interest in seeing documentation. There is a beautiful symmetry here between making presentations and consuming them. And this is true for all of these principles. That is, as a smart consumer of a nonfiction presentation, you want to see comparisons being made. You want to hear questions of causality addressed. You want to see them wandering around, not just in flatland, but in a more complex multivariate world. You want a pluralism of evidence, whatever it takes, and you want to see the material documented. This symmetry is a very powerful idea. One way to put it is we're all in the same boat, consumers and presenters. And that's because of how these 5 grand principles, and there are a few others around, these 5 principles were derived. Probably the deepest question in theorizing about most anything, and particularly say about design, is where do principles come from? How do I just announce the principles? Or is there some good idea? Well, I think there's a good idea behind these 5 principles, which is that the principles of display and also consumption of display, design principles, are just like the principles of analytical thinking. And so what I did in this theory is to ask, what are the fundamental principles, the fundamental cognitive tasks when we look at information? And then turn them into instructions to designers and to consumers and of presentations and into presenters. So the thing we know in looking at data is the fundamental intellectual task is making comparisons. Okay, that's instructions now to how we prepare our presentation. Show comparisons. A fundamental intellectual task all over the world in understanding materials and reasoning about them is to understand causality and mechanism and explanation. That now is turned into design principles. Show causality. So we go back and forth between using the fundamental cognitive tasks to instruct our methods of display and presentation. For the first time, there is a principled theory of design. Most design is based on fashion, what's hot or what's cool, or it's based on what the software happens to throw up, which is the right metaphor, or in consumer products, the infinite possible convenience of the consumer. No, at least for nonfiction reasoning about information, the design should be based on the fundamental cognitive tasks that human beings engage in when they look at things. That is, they make comparisons, think about causality, worry about credibility, try to wander around something better than flatland, and whatever it takes in terms of the information. Another way to put this is the point of an information display is to assist understanding. What is understanding of information? Making comparisons, understanding causality, understanding a complex multivariate world, worrying about documentation, credibility, using different modes of evidence completely integrated. Here's the more speculative part of these principles. These cognitive tasks are universal. Everybody everywhere has to, just to get out of bed in the morning, has to think causally. Everybody everywhere makes comparisons. Everybody everywhere reasons well, routinely in 4 space, tries to understand things in 4 dimensions, even if they're on flatland display surfaces, such as a stone or a computer screen. And if the cognitive principles are universal, then that drags along the design principles, and this is even more speculative, this universalism, which is that these cognitive tasks, and therefore the design principles, are indifferent to language, to century, to culture, to gender, or whatever the particular mode of display is today. These ideas apply with equal force to the first map scratched into a piece of stone 6,000 years ago, or to something on the web. This is highly speculative, and let me even be more speculative. Well, why should these thinking tasks be universal? Well, think what it might require for a sentient being to navigate through a world governed by nature's laws. Nature's laws, which govern the behavior of every physical object in the universe, every atom, are causal. They operate in multivariate space. They reveal themselves by difference and comparison. Sounds kind of like the fundamental cognitive tasks. This is all speculation. It's not necessary for the argument. The argument is much tighter, which is let's turn fundamental cognitive tasks into principles for making presentations, consuming presentations, and doing design. The rest is speculative. Oh, and there's a grand principle 6. And it grows out of how Minar, the engineer, came to make probably the best display of evidence, at least in the 19th century, and maybe a good many other centuries as well. Minar was a very talented engineer, as you can see by the sense of facticity in the diagram. He certainly had the skills to do this. He could draw and see and count. But he didn't do this miracle as an exercise in drawing or seeing or counting. He made this because he hated war. This, right from the start, was meant as an anti-war poster. Right from the start, it was driven by a deep knowledge and a deep concern, a deep passion about the content. And that's Grand Principle 6, the content principle, which is serious presentations, serious nonfiction presentations, largely stand or fall, depending on the quality and the relevance and the integrity of the content. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.